Hello, my name is Mitch. This is where I paint. This is what I paint. This is Murphy. It's in process right now, and it's a watercolor. And I'm going to show you how I do this at a later time. First, we have to discuss the basics of watercolor painting. And to do that, we'll discuss paper, how it's made, its sizes, and its composition. Then we'll talk about stretching paper and why we do it and why you need to know it. And then we'll talk about certain techniques, washes, tools, materials, and paint. So with that in mind, we'll start now with the basics of paper composition. Paper is made out of fibrous plant materials. Almost any that you can think of that are fibrous can be turned into paper. And the process is basically you just beat it up, cook it, break it down, put it on a screen or something similar to a screen, and let it settle. And then once it's settled, you take it out and you dry it, and you have paper. Now, there are really three types of paper: machine-made paper, handmade paper, and mold-made paper. Machine-made paper is like newsprint and things like that, and it's easy to figure out whether it's machine-made or not simply by taking a piece of paper, tearing it one way. Tears pretty straight. You tear it the other way, and it's not going to tear straight. That's machine. That's because they roll it down in one direction all the time. And all the fibers are aligned like this. Now when you do handmade paper, they're all tangled up. And in the same way with mold-made paper. Now, and what we want to use when we make paper is a material that is non-acidic. You want something that's acid neutral or at least acid free. The reason for that is that acid works on the paper and it turns it brown, like old newspapers that lay out in the street nobody picks up. They'll turn brown and it'll disintegrate eventually. Now, if you want a painting that you want to keep or to archive, you want to do it on the best paper possible, which is cotton paper, and it's acid free. If you're into reproductions and you don't really care about your original, you can put it on any paper. It doesn't matter. Because once you get your original done, you take it down, you get it photographed, and you get it reproduced. And that's fine. That's just a form of art. Now, I've told you there are three types of manufacturing processes used in paper making: machine-made, handmade, and mold-made. Mold-made is also done commercially. That's the paper that most watercolor artists use. Some people like handmade paper. Some people make their own paper, and that's fine. If you want to go off and do that, it's time-consuming, requires a lot of work, a lot of study, but you can do it. Mold-made paper has been made by these people for years and years and years, and they're very good at it. Almost any of the major manufacturers of paper are excellent for doing watercolor. You just have to pick one that suits your style, and you have to pick the texture that suits your style. Now, when I talk about texture, I'm really talking about mold-made paper, because handmade paper typically doesn't have the three textures that mold-made does. They have texture, but they're unique to the person that made the paper itself. The three textures that we'll deal with are rough, cold press, and hot press. The problem with rough paper is that you're not going to make corrections very easily. If you do, want to scrub something out or lift it out, which we'll talk about this later too, you're going to damage the paper, the surface of the paper, and then you're going to spoil the effect. Now, the next one is, and I'm going to talk about, is hot press. Very smooth. It's good for detail work. Very good for detail work if you like doing that. If you're going to do big, broad washes, you're probably going to have problems with the lines. When you put a wash on, you put the first stroke on, and then you go down and do the next stroke, well, you're probably going to wind up with a line there, and you probably don't want to do that. Now, that's not the only factor. There are other additive factors that affect how that paint's going to work on the surface of that paper, but it's still a consideration. Sometimes I'll use hot press paper. This painting here is done on cold press paper. That's the paper I prefer. It suits my technique. It's in between rough and smooth. It allows me to put down washes. The texture holds the washes. It allows me to do detail to the extent that I want it to be. Now that we've talked about the various textures, I'll tell you a little bit about other papers and why I don't use other types of paper. Most contests and exhibitions require that you paint on paper. You can paint on other things. Recently there's watercolor canvas, fine. So that's the basic paper types. And the next thing we'll discuss is the sizes. Okay, we're going to talk about paper size and paper weight. The standard size of watercolor paper is 22 by 30 inches. This is a standard size of watercolor paper. You can get bigger. It's called elephant, and it's called double elephant. You're going to need a mighty big wall to hang anything a double elephant or an elephant size. Even when you map this out, it's a pretty good size, so you have to consider the size. Go a lot smaller. You can go a half sheet, you can go a quarter sheet, or there's even other varieties based on blocks and stuff. You buy, the metric sizes and stuff. Now the weight of watercolor paper. This one is 140 pounds. That means 500 sheets of this paper weighs 140 pounds. Typically you have 140 pound, 300 pound, 500 pound watercolor paper. There are some 90 pound stuff I never use it. It's too thin. Now, when you talk about the weight of watercolor paper, the metric way of measuring it makes a lot more sense. It's really the thickness of the paper. So when somebody says something's 140 pounds paper, you about double that and it becomes 300 grams per square meter. 300 pound paper, 600 and something grams per square meter. And of course you just do the same for 500 pounds. Basically what we're talking about is how thick is the paper. The thicker the paper, the less effect watercolor has on it when you wet it down. And we're going to talk about that later too. And we're going to talk about the various sizes and forms that watercolor paper comes in when it comes to stretching and not stretching watercolor paper.